Miles away, riding in trucks and half-tracks through the Bavarian countryside, soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Rainbow Division began to notice it. Sweet, putrid, wrong. Men who had fought through North Africa and Sicily, who had waded onto the beaches of Anzio and clawed across the Rhine, hardened, combat-forged soldiers, started pulling their scarves up over their faces and saying nothing. It was April 29th, 1945. The war in Europe had 9 days left, and nothing these men had already survived would prepare them for what was waiting at the end of that road. Dachau was not a secret, not entirely. Established on March 22nd, 1933, roughly 8 weeks after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor, it was the first of the Nazi concentration camps, a model, a blueprint, a prototype for everything that would come after. For Himmler called it a training ground. The SS learned their methods there. For 12 years, the camp had existed about 10 miles northwest of Munich, and the residents of the surrounding town had smelled that same smell on the wind, and most of them had chosen not to ask what it was. By April 1945, Dachau held approximately 32,000 registered prisoners: Poles, Jews, Soviet POWs, Catholic priests, political dissidents, Spanish Republicans. Dachau was not, technically, an extermination camp in the way Auschwitz or Treblinka were. A gas chamber was built, but there is no credible evidence it was ever used for mass killings. But people died there every single day, from starvation, from disease, from beatings, from medical experiments conducted by men in white coats who refer to their victims in case notes as the subject. In the final weeks, as the Allied advance pushed toward Munich, the SS had attempted to evacuate Dachau. They forced what prisoners could still walk on death marches south toward the Alps. Those who fell were shot on the roadside. Thousands died on those roads, and American soldiers would encounter their bodies for miles before they ever reached the front gate. The men rolling toward Dachau on April 29th knew they were approaching a concentration camp. Some had heard the word. Almost none of them understood what that meant. They were about to find out. A freight train sat on the rail spur outside the camp. 39 boxcars stopped, going nowhere. The smell was overwhelming. When the first soldiers slid open a door, they stumbled back. The car was packed with bodies, hundreds of them, skeletal, emaciated, stacked and slumped against one another, dressed in the ragged striped uniforms of concentration camp prisoners. Some of the dead had their hands raised, frozen in a final act of clawing at the walls. Car after car, the same thing. More than 2,000 corpses in the train. The SS had loaded them up days earlier, intending to move them, somewhere, anywhere, and then abandoned them when the Americans came too fast. The prisoners had died locked inside, without water, without food, without air. Soldiers who had been laughing and smoking cigarettes 10 minutes earlier went silent. Some vomited. Some wept. Some simply could not move. One soldier, Corporal Harold Porter, later wrote a letter home describing the scene. He wrote that he didn't believe anyone back home would be able to believe what he was looking at. They hadn't even entered the camp yet. They moved through the main gate. Arbeit macht frei, iron letters meaning work makes you free, a phrase that also appeared at Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, and several other camps. And what waited inside was beyond language. Piles of bodies near the crematorium, thousands of them. The ovens had been running day and night for years, and still the dead had outpaced the flames. Prisoners were dying faster than the SS could dispose of them. And then the living appeared. Survivors pressed up against the wire fences, barbed, electrified, and stared. Some wept. Some reached through the wire. Some were too far gone to react at all, standing in their filth, and staring with eyes that seemed already to belong to another world. Their bodies were barely bodies, skeletal arms, distended abdomens, sunken faces. A soldier named William Cowling wrote in his diary, "I have never seen people so thin in my life." The soldiers began tearing open their ration packs. They threw chocolate bars and canned food through the wire. Army doctors immediately tried to stop them. Starvation victims whose digestive systems had shut down could die from eating solid food too quickly. But the impulse was impossible to contain. These were men who had been trained to fight, and there was nothing here left to fight. There was only this: helplessness, grief, rage. The rage was building. Not all of the SS garrison had fled. In the chaos and speed of the liberation, a significant number had remained. Some were in the process of surrendering. Others had changed out of their SS uniforms and were attempting to blend with regular Wehrmacht troops. A few had put on prisoner clothing. Credible estimates place somewhere between 100 and 300 German military personnel still present at Dachau when the Americans arrived. Many of the original SS garrison had fled in the preceding days as the Allied advance accelerated. What happened next is documented, investigated, partially suppressed, and still debated. The first incident unfolded at the coal yard near the camp perimeter. A group of SS guards had been gathered there under the supervision of Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead of the 45th Infantry Division. Bushyhead had organized the segregation of SS from regular Wehrmacht prisoners. A machine gun opened fire. When it stopped, and multiple guards were dead. An investigation was launched. The investigation was quietly closed. No one was court-martialed. But that was only the beginning. At multiple points throughout the camp that afternoon, SS guards were shot, not during firefights, not while resisting. Some had their hands up, some were on their knees. One of the most documented incidents involved a group of SS prisoners being marched through the camp when survivors, prisoners who had somehow found the physical strength, broke free of the crowd and attacked them with their bare hands and with tools and with pieces of wood. American soldiers, standing nearby, did not intervene. Some watched, some turned away. A few reportedly stepped back to allow it to happen. A Belgian prisoner survivor later described the scene simply: "You cannot understand what we had lived through, and you cannot understand what it felt like to finally see them afraid." Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding officer of the 157th Infantry's 3rd Battalion, arrived at the coal yard during or just after the first shootings and physically intervened to stop further killings. He was enraged, not at his men for their impulse, but at the situation, at what the camp had made necessary, at what the war had produced. The US Army's own investigation, conducted by a judge advocate, concluded that approximately 21 SS personnel were killed by American soldiers that day, not in combat, not in an exchange of fire, but in what legally constituted extrajudicial killings. An additional 25 to 50 were killed by liberated prisoners. The true figures remain disputed, and the complete picture will likely never be known. The US Army launched a formal investigation. General George Patton, by then serving as military governor of Bavaria, reviewed the findings and dismissed the charges under his command authority. The case was ultimately closed by a judge advocate ruling in late 1945. No American soldier was ever prosecuted for the killings at Dachau. Patton's reasoning, informal and never entered into the official record, was essentially this: he was not going to court-martial men for what they had done after seeing Dachau. To understand what happened that day, You have to understand what the soldiers were processing in real time. They found the crematorium, the ovens, human ash, bones, a room stacked with naked corpses waiting to be burned. As they found the medical experimentation block, records, equipment, the detailed documentation of experiments conducted on prisoners without anesthesia, hypothermia trials, high-altitude pressure tests, malaria experiments, and seawater ingestion tests on unwilling human subjects. The files were meticulous, clinical, filed alphabetically. They found the punishment cells, isolation chambers barely large enough for a single person to stand in, used to hold prisoners in total darkness for days or weeks. They found the roll call square, where prisoners had been forced to stand for hours in freezing temperatures as punishment for escape attempts by others. They found 12 years of human suffering compressed into a few acres of Bavarian countryside. Sergeant Liberator Milano, a Brooklyn-born soldier who had served since North Africa, and later said in an oral history interview, "I don't have words, I still don't have words, and I've had my whole life to find them." The military investigation into the killings of SS guards was formally designated as the Dachau Massacre, referring, in US military terminology, to what the American soldiers had done to the guards, not what the guards had done to the prisoners. The investigators identified specific units and, in some cases, specific individuals. Reports were written. Charges were recommended. Then, the reports travelled up the chain of command. Patton, as military governor of Bavaria, dismissed the charges. A judge advocate's review in late 1945 concluded that, given what the soldiers had witnessed, prosecution was not warranted. No American soldier was ever tried. The Inspector General report was classified and remained largely inaccessible until the late 1980s. Soldiers who had been there rarely talked about it, not because they were ashamed, but because they didn't know how to explain a thing that existed outside the normal categories of right and wrong. For a long time, the official history of Dachau's liberation focused on the rescue. The photographs of emaciated survivors, the first hot meals, the medical teams, the liberation, the relief, the killings were there in the record, just buried under it. Here is the question that every historian who has studied that day eventually arrives at. Were the killings wrong? Not legally. That part is relatively clear. Extrajudicial execution of prisoners of war violates the Geneva Conventions. By the letter of international law, what American soldiers did at Dachau on April 29, 1945, was a war crime. The US Army's own judge advocate said as much at the time. But legality and morality are not the same thing, and they have never been less aligned than they were in that place, on that day. These were not ordinary prisoners of war. Some of the men shot against that wall had operated the crematoria. Some had conducted the selections. Some had supervised the death marches. Some had held the whips and the batons and the rifles that had turned 32,000 human beings into the living skeletons pressing against the wire. And the Americans who pulled the triggers had spent the last 4 hours walking through the physical evidence of what those men had done. Had looked into the faces of survivors who had watched friends and family murdered by these same guards. Had stood in front of ovens still containing human remains. There is no comfortable answer here. There was no comfortable answer on April 29th, 1945 either. What there was this. Men who had been pushed to the edge of something. Soldiers who had crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. And a system that eventually, quietly, decided not to look too closely at what had happened on the other side. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, 9 days after Dachau. Most of the soldiers who were there that April afternoon came home, got jobs, raised families, grew old. Many of them never spoke about what they had seen or what had happened. The ones who did talk often waited until very near the end of their lives, when there was nothing left to lose by saying it out loud. The camp at Dachau still stands. It is a memorial now. And the barracks, the roll call square, the crematorium, the gas chamber that was built but, according to all credible historical evidence, never used for mass murder. Hundreds of thousands of visitors come every year, approaching or exceeding 1 million in recent years. The train tracks are still there. The boxcars are gone, but the tracks remain, running right up to the perimeter of a place that 12 years of organized cruelty built, and that took an army one afternoon to reach. The men who liberated Dachau carried it for the rest of their lives. Every single one of them. The ones who shot guards and the ones who didn't. The ones who wept and the ones who went numb. The ones who threw their rations through the fence and the ones who could not bring themselves to look. There are photographs from that day. American soldiers, still in combat gear, walking through the camp. Some are looking at the camera. Most are not. Their faces tell you everything that language cannot.